Okay, good morning. My name is James Danger, and so I'd like to talk about the Istanbul consensus on oocyte and embryo, both static and dynamic morphological assessments. This is an update of their original 2011 consensus, and this is not part one, but part I, which is a summary of a survey of IVF laboratories on the initial implementation of the first consensus. So this update was published in Human Reproduction RBM Online. It's freely available, an essential reading for all laboratory staff, both current and non-laboratory staff. It's a mixture of the ESHRE group on embryology and the Alpha Science and Reproductive Medicine, and it's a consensus document that provides several novel recommendations to assess oocyte and embryo morphology and rank embryos for transfer. It is an update of a previous consensus published in 2011, and these are the two URLs where you can find these documents. I think it's essential reading for all new staff to basically ask them to go and read the document. When you find the document is very big, it's far too big just to do one review. So I plan over the next little while to review each section separately. But I have to give credit at this point to each and every scientist who have devoted considerable time and effort to produce both the original and this updated version. Each section will provide a current status of update on both the basic and the changing aspects of describing embryos at each stage of their development. After all, embryos still look the same as in 1978 when I first saw them, but it's just that one strives for best practice, one needs a common language. This at the outset, I'd also like to say it's a shame that all the societies and interest groups did not lend their name to this document. It's still very much an ESHRE alpha document. There is a lot of diversity between clinics and countries and societies, as this review will show, and hopefully by the end of some reason I will appreciate there is more cohesion. We all know embryos grow continuously over time, but in defined stages, and when examined episodically, they're both visually and continuously with time lapse. But in a funny sort of way, descriptions only have meaning when stage and time are defined together. But we do have to recognize that each stage will require a different set of parameters to be able to describe them. And the aim is for all staff to describe embryos the same way and make the same decisions on which to transfer, which to freeze, and which to discard. The reality is only about 1 in every 8 embryos will produce a live birth. The aim is for, as I said before, is for every embryologist to describe every embryo the same way and to rank each embryo in the same order. I know that PGT-A nucleoid testing and time-lapse algorithms contribute to this goal, but using the same terminology is always going to be the starting point. I have to acknowledge that the industry has developed into a somewhat mishmash of ways of describing embryos, but then the reality is that every embryologist thinks they know best. But their ranking is largely unregulated and dynamic, and the aim of the consensus is to minimize the variability between scientists. Despite constant publications suggesting there is a large variation between staff, most will nominate the same embryo for transfer. And I know this from running my EQA program at FirstAid for 25 years, where I asked embryologists to rank the embryos. There is huge consensus about which is the best. Societies haven't helped by publishing their own guidelines and being somewhat parochial in how they describe that. And it's time for IVF to become less parochial, less country organised, and to become international. The original consensus in 2011 was a mixture of collaboration between a variety of groups published under the banner of the Alpha and ESHRE special interest groups. But what's happened between 2011 and 2025? More blastocyst culture, introduction of time-lapse technologies, development of PGT-A and vitrification, focus on euploid transfers, analysis of spent culture media, and new ways to analyze embryos in terms of their metabolism, and introduction of AI, in the corporatization of the IVF industry, where many small clinics are now clumped into large industrial bodies. There's been more staff, more turnover, but there is a constant need for training new staff, and this is what this document should be addressing. If you look at the activity, you can see where there's an estimate of the number of babies born up to 2018. You see this huge exponential rise, and a rise in each different area, but the main one has been in Asia, both China and Southeast Asia. But each individual area is also growing. And this is also documented by the number of publications each year, which I think has peaked in 2023 at almost 2,500 publications just on IVF. If you add embryos, sperm, eggs, it's about 10,000. It is just enormous how many publications have been made. You just can't keep up with it. So, however, before reviewing the consensus paper, the authors thought it may be worthwhile understanding how well the initial consensus was applied and utilised. The group did this by looking at the results of a survey, which is found in the document's appendix supplementary material. The survey, as I understand it, was largely a manual one, where they were sent to a variety of clinics who filled it out, and then someone as diligently compiled that data into a graphic form. The initial consensus, so this isn't the new one, this is a review of the original one, was really a consensus based on a meeting of people from ESRA, from Spain, the ASE-BIR, the UK ACE group, the American SARC group. These were canvassed in the survey. And if you like, the survey was really a quality audit activity to review how well the consensus was received and followed. Was it a waste of time? What areas need to be improved? And does it reflect the current status of IVF? The summary, I think, is the second supplementary notes. This is how it's presented, a series of graphics, which I'll go through individually because they're quite interesting. The first is that you can see of the 539 centres, more than about 2/3 came from Europe, which tells you their alpha ESRA bias, and would hope that the next survey done in 5 and 10 years' time is far more internationally represented. There's a lot from Asia, but notice there's 4 from Australia, but I know there's 30, 40 clinics, and that may well represent the corporatisation of IVF that's been horrendous in Australia. But also in America, only 35 replies from America and 16 from South America. 21 from Africa. I assume many of those are from the Middle East, but also there's quite a few big Z clinics in Nigeria and elsewhere. So the first lot of data, they must have been sort of mixed reviews when they realised that only about 35% of clinics implemented the consensus entirely without any changes, but more than half the clinics responded they have taken the consensus and modified in some way, and 13% of clinics didn't use the consensus at all. If you look at the application of the criteria for cleavage stage embryos, that's just under 60% used the Istanbul consensus for describing cleavage stage embryos. But Spain, which has a huge IVF history, 14% used their own grading system. The Americans, about 8% used their system. 60% used other, which included ACE, and 6% were not available. So about 55% of clinics use the consensus for describing cleavage stage embryos. It's a different situation for blastocysts, where instead of using the Istanbul consensus for describing blastocysts, about just over 60%, excuse me, applying what was still considered the benchmark, the gold standard, which is Gardner's code. We all recognise this code was excellent when it was first introduced, but it does suffer from being too vague and open to misrepresentation. So, for instance, is the embryo shown here, is this a 4AA or a 4AB? And so you can see it's a great in-cell mass, but the trifectinome does vary across the periphery, and therefore it depends where you grade it or how you will grade it, A or B. It always needed more subtle criteria and suffers from the need for the embryo to be aligned correctly to diagnose the inner cell mass. If you look at the scoring system by region for cleavage stage and blastocysts, you can see that Africa and Asia and Europe to some extent implemented the Istanbul consensus in the majority of cases. North America and South America, not so much. The North America had their own scheme, 15 or 30 years to start. And Australia was only 4 clinics, you can't tell much. But when you go back and look at the blastocyst culture, you can see that the Gardner scheme totally dominates. So the The consensus system for scoring blastocysts has not been implemented. That's how you could define it. But the majority of regions, about 60% applied the Gardner system. Excuse me. Let's have a little wee drink. And I think it'll be interesting to see how well the new update will actually address this issue. But in a funny way, I think this is just a issue of terminology, since the Gardner's grade 4AA in the consensus is, I understand it, 411. In 2011, the consensus, it was the numerical interpretation of Gardner scale that was how it was described. Now, still in published articles, it may not be seen by the readers as the same, hence the need for an updated consensus terminology. Note here that 1 for the Escher consensus group is good, but in Gardner scheme 1 it indicates poor, whereas A is always the best quality. I also note that in Australia, there were the 9 replies, 5 of those were using the ACE system. And I think some ways it shows where the senior scientist comes from that may dictate the classification used, and that any paper published by Australian authors may not be applying Gardner's or consensus grading, but the ACE one, which is a fairly redundant minority one. It also goes to show how many the English love coming to Australia. So I think it's the start of the surf and the beer. However, since most clinics are increasingly culturing embryos to day 506, this is where the new consensus need to be focused and aim for universal description, and it will be enjoyable to describe that section of the update. I also believe that urgently work from all societies to harmonise the descriptors of blastocysts, especially with ranking and transfer, need to undertake. And I think that the alpha ester group needed to be more outgoing and encourage more societies to lend their support to what they're trying to do. Now, one of the interesting things about it, how they apply this consensus to daily practice. And some of these graphs are easy to understand, some are not that thing, and I've actually stumbled a bit over them trying to understand it. The first one was applying the consensus rules for when our grading should be done. So, for instance, the consensus recommended 17 hours plus or minus 1 hour for the FERT check, for 68 hours for day 3, and 116 hours for blastocyst culture. And you can see that by and large, it's about 70% use these recommendations for timing for assessment for both the critical ones at day 3, day 1, day 3, day 5, but all the other times there's people that just haven't been that interested. However, applied in the description as put out by the consensus, I think there's been a bit of a mix-up here, because people are saying 81% applied the consensus, but we know that's the consensus plus Gardner system. But by and large, the rules that they set out for describing pronuclear stage, cleavage stage blastocysts have been applied, but far less interest in applying all the other recommendations about oocytes and early day 1 embryos. People are far less concerned about using their recommendations. But basically, about 2/3 of people are following the recommendations, which really, in 2025, is not good enough. There should really be a good consensus at this time, and journals should be forcing authors to use the correct documentation. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, trying to understand what they're doing. This is actually where they rely on these recommendations for their daily practice. So this, I think, is where they say one person will write the grading down, and then another staff member will make use of that to decide which embryos to transfer and freeze, or for data collection, etc. So this is where you're actually using the information in daily practice. And basically, it's the same as before. About 65-70% of clinics rely on this information for their FERT check, day 3 and day 5. So what someone writes down, someone else is using to make a decision. And I think that's what they're trying to get at. Part of the problem, of course, is timing. So this will actually vary on how busy clinics are. So clinics doing 1 or 2 or 3 pickups a day have no problem in sticking to the times and using the documentation. But busy clinics will have lots of different staff members assessing embryos at different times. And this is where you need to rely on the consensus. So everyone knows if you have 3 staff members doing embryo checks, then you need to make sure they're all describing it the same way, but they do rely heavily on the consensus values. So this one was for the previous one was on timing, and this one was on the grading system, and it's basically the same. Basically, 80% rely on the grading people, staff members put on embryo for making decisions. There's 60% for cleavage and pronuclear, and like everything else, the impact of the descriptors, that the consensus for the oocyte and early zygote are far less of interest, and many clinics just don't document that information, including the description of the oocyte cumulus complex. And a couple of final tables. One was the day of fresh transfer. So they flipped the colours around so that now blue represents very little application, whereas before blue was important. So the colours did flummox me slightly. However, you can say that 40% of clinics never do a day 2 transfer, and those that do are probably only doing single embryo transfers or natural cycles or whatever. 70% of clinics will perform a day 3 transfer at least 50% of the time. 40% of the clinics will do a day 4 transfer occasionally, but I think hardly anyone does a day 4 transfer. 1% of clinics never ever perform a blastocyst. So 1% of clinics never grow their embryos to day 5. But interestingly enough, only 17% of clinics only ever do day 5 transfers. So that even most clinics, 80% of clinics, 82% of clinics, will keep their options open about doing transfers on day 2, day 3, or maybe day 4. But these ones here, I think, are the ones that are really pushing PGT-A. And there are some people that publish data where all their patients all go to PGT-A. But you can actually say that about 65% of clinics will transfer blastocysts at least half of the time. And 16% of clinics, about 1 in 8, are obviously growing those embryos out to day 7, and they may freeze them if it's good enough blastocysts, although the data from it is pretty disappointing. And I think to a large extent, this information is a function of both the application of PGT-A and embryo treating older women. So despite the literature heavily slanted towards blastocysts and especially to euploid transfers, 83% of clinics will still perform cleavage stage transfers, and therefore the terminology for these stages and its application remains essential. The day of preservation is also of interest. There are still 25% of clinics who may freeze embryos on day 2, and half the clinics will freeze embryos on day 3 at least some of the time. However, what I find interesting is 50% of clinics only freeze embryos on day 5. Some will freeze, half of them will freeze on day 7 if there is a blastocyst. Slightly difficult table to interpret, but I think what it's telling you is that even though an awful lot of clinics will do day 2 and day 3 transfers, very few people are freezing embryos on day 3, and most are growing them to day 5. And so the 50% cryopreservation, so these clinics only, this is 95 to 100% of clinics, 50% of all clinics surveyed, all their embryos are frozen as blastocysts. And that to me is a reflection of PGT-A, which the next survey will be higher. And the last three on time lapse. Half the clinics have time lapse and half don't. And of those with it, they apply time lapse to all their embryology. So 25% of all clinics use time lapse for everything. 15% use time lapse for special cases, and 15% for clients that request it. This might be an overestimate in the whole world, since many clinics may not be part of the alpha SRA group, but still represent considerable market penetration. And there's a lot to be said for how we will be describing embryos both in timing and descriptors based on the one-dimensional aspect of time-lapse imagery. Excuse me. I need a good cup of tea. In terms of algorithms, this is a fairly loose term. I'm not entirely sure what it's describing, but you can say that half the clinics don't use any form of interpretation of what the outcome's likely to be. I think what they're using algorithms here is to predict the outcome for helping clients make decisions. So they're using an algorithm for a particular case to give advice to the couple about what type of treatment they should have. 50% use an algorithm they developed in-house. 15% for algorithms developed by manufacturers, and 10% by other groups, etc. I think this is going to continue to grow as computers as patient management systems continue to grow, which collect all the data on patient management. They will continue to apply AI systems from their database to help clients make decisions about how to be treated. In terms of AI, only 14% are using AI. This is, I think, where the time lapse will give a value to an embryo, and then they're using that value to make decisions about which embryo to transfer, etc. Only 15% say yes, and the majority of those are from time lapse video, but also assessments of embryos of static images. There's been a lot of publications on that, quite a few on sperm selection and oocyte selection. And of all those things, I think that this is the one where we'll hope to see basically more development, because this is the key for working out which embryos will be euploid and euploid and will grow. So I expect the low amount of AI applications changing rapidly with time. What I thought was interesting was a wide range of applications, especially for sperm and oocyte assessment. I also think that many embryologists have more faith in their own observational skills than anticipated. The black box idea used by AI to generate values for embryos is also a problem. However, I may well be out on a limb here. So if you'd like to add a comment to expand how one interprets it, please make a comment. And lastly, but far from least, is a table looking at the nomenclature for clinically non-usable blasts. So in total, 81% of the respondents considered it helpful to have a university accepted term to classify clinically non-usable blasts. Basically, some basically didn't have a scheme. Some people thought it should be based on the ICM, some on trifectoderm, and basically other nomenclature. But in reality, what's interesting is, as I said, this is a really important question, since this is the terminology that clients will hear when told their embryos are not worth transferring. You do need to have a consistent sort of terminology. At the time of 2011 consensus, there was very little discussion about euploid embryos, but there may be far more 4AA embryos that are not usable because they are now classified as aneuploid. So, in summary, this survey has shown that consensus has been valuable and is largely used throughout the IVF industry, yet many societies continue to apply subtly different standards, making a common language somewhat problematic. Coffee. Having a consensus that included all other societies, as I'm sure is a future goal, since embryos the world over are the same, so should be their description. I also think this survey should be repeated regularly, so every 5 to so years, so laboratory staff will know if they need to update their processes and skills. It might also be valuable to include other elements assessed, including follicle and endometrial reporting, PGT-A reporting, where I know there's been a lot of concern about the variations in how embryos are being labelled as mosaic, and guidelines for non-invasive PGT-A, which I think is going to become the next 10 years really critical, particularly with RNA analysis. I know these are not embryological, not part of the initial brief, but they're all starting the same process. So, having completed section 11, I'm now faced with a daunting task of going through and assessing each one, and I think I will choose this one to the next one, because both this stage by far and away are the important one. And lastly, there's a really great little graphic just illustrating how difficult it is to assess embryos during normal working hours. Each line is a check for different stages of development, and you can see the dark lines of which are available during working hours and the green for non-working hours. And you can see how time-lapse imagery over time will increasingly revolutionize how we describe embryos. I'm sure there's lots of opinions on the result of the survey and my comments on them. I hope so anyway. So please express these opinions in the comment section so that others can read and learn. Just like to finish up by thanking everyone and saying my name's James Stanger. I'm an embryologist. with more than 50 years experience. I'm not a medical person, and this information is not medical advice, but it may help you knowing what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor and understanding. If you like what I'm doing, press subscribe and press like. If you really want to support me, you can make a donation to my GoFundMe page, and please leave a comment and press like. Just like a quick plug for my other activity, which is running an online EQA program at firdaid.com. And it's a training program in IVF for andrology and embryology. So I'd like to thank you for your time. I know IVF is a personal journey that involves the action of many techniques, ideas, and staff, and helps to understand all aspects of that journey. I hope this information has been of value. If you like, tell everyone else you know about my service, and please subscribe. And just to finish, this is what we're going in the future. This is how we may be describing the futures based on both the defected and cell mass and the day of transfer, and they'll all be different grades: good, poor, early blastocyst, and then ranking 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is, I think, where we're going, a more simplified version. And I think at this point in time, I will say enough is enough, and thank you for your time.